Syndrome is a sci-fi survival horror game that places you in a living hell inside a doomed starship. Find out what happened to your crew. Run, hide, fight, and survive. Well, you were doing a lot of running anyway. Syndrome is true to its definition in conception, but the final result leaves a lot to be desired. It's part System Shock 2, part Dead Space, and part Alien Isolation, but it doesn't hold a candle to any of those games, and it has some absolutely horrid mechanics and antiquated gameplay. It's now available on Steam for Microsoft Windows, with a release for the consoles apparently planned in the near future. So things start off well enough, if a little bit cliche. Your character Officer Gallon wakes up from cryosleep to find the crew of the Valkenburg ship all murdered or turned into horrific half-man, half-machine monsters. All this story is missing is a distress signal, amnesia, and some kind of space virus. Anyway, from very early on, your two main contacts are a woman named Naomi working for the military and an engineer named James Marco, both of whom have their own agendas.
You can call me Jimmy.
Like System Shock 2, you can find plenty of logs left around the ship that will fill in the blanks for the story and give you a bit of an insight into the events that led up to when shit hit the fan on the Valkenburg. Now, there's 8 decks of the ship in total, and you'll frequently and frustratingly be going back and forth between each of them as you complete your objectives. Head to deck 6, then back to deck 3, then to deck 4, then to deck 2, then back to deck 6, and so forth. It is so goddamn tedious, and it makes the campaign feel more like a constant fetch quest than a cohesive narrative. It took me around 10 hours to finish the whole thing, and half of that is spent moving back and forth between decks. It is beyond irritating at times.
According to the ship's logs, Captain Marius' last entry was in the officer's quarters on deck 7.
Reminds me a lot of those parts in Alien Isolation where you basically run around the Sevastopol doing maintenance work. I mean, imagine that stretched out for an entire game. Aside from taking gameplay influence from Alien Isolation, I think Syndrome also takes visual influence from it as well. In fact, I think there's certain decks of the Valkenburg that look like they've been ripped right out of Alien Isolation. Truth be told though, Syndrome is a pretty damn good looking game. The attention to detail with some of the lighting is just superb, and most environments show off a hell of a lot of polish. It can be a little bit too dark at times, though at least you get a flashlight, which doesn't make it too bad. There's all heaps of cluttering visual effects like chromatic aberration, bloom, and depth of field, all of which can be switched off if need be, and performance-wise the game runs pretty smoothly with the occasional hitch, but nothing major. I should also give props to the sound department with some truly unsettling atmospheric sound work, great effects for the various monsters, and voice acting that all things considered gets the job done. I mean, in terms of the presentation, it's kind of hard to fault Syndrome. Unfortunately, Sunny Jim's, it's the gameplay where it all just starts to fall apart, and boy does it fall apart. Now look, it does get some things right. I mean, I do like the inclusion of manual saves and the absence of checkpoints. It gives the game much more of a survival horror feel, and it makes those moments when you're praying to find a save point much more tense. I also like how bringing up your map and inventory doesn't pause the game, meaning you can't just artificially pause the game time to heal yourself in the middle of a fight. Another way Syndrome takes influence from System Shock 2 is the rarity of supplies you come across in the game. I mean, you're never going to have more than maybe 1 or 2 healing kits, and your weapons will barely ever be fully loaded. You're always waiting to come across that next small stockpile of supplies and let off a short sigh of relief as you feel a brief sense of safety. The way they've spaced out the items in Syndrome is actually very well implemented, and I always felt like I had just enough items I needed as long as I didn't get overzealous and start gunning down every monster I saw, or healing every single time I took a slither of damage. The issue is that the gameplay is largely broken up between stealth and combat, and neither of these are really any good, like at all. I started to wonder if the developers made these elements ironically bad, as if it was another way of paying homage to System Shock 2, but then I realized that even the combat in System Shock 2 is superior to that in Syndrome. Stealth is quite literally broken at times, and the absolute minimum required to include a stealth component in a video game. As is pretty standard, whenever you're crouching you make less sound, and enemies react to the amount of noise you make. Problems lie in the fact that your crouching speed is aggravatingly slow, almost feeling more like a crawl than a crouch, making it an utter chore to sneak around, and yet you're all but forced into stealth against the tougher enemies, as most of them can kill you in a single hit. On top of that, your running speed is so pitiful you have no chance of outrunning them, and to make it even more annoying, there's no lean button either, or even a jump button for that matter. Most of the enemies pretty much just move around at random too, which sounds like a good thing, but it really isn't. I mean, they might be moving down a corridor for instance, then just randomly do a 180 and start walking in the other direction for no goddamn reason. I think the problem here is that we're never fully told how the rules around the stealth works. In a game like Thief the Dark Project, we know that if we're in the darkness and we don't move on certain surfaces that we're all but invisible. We know that in the old Metal Gear Solid games, as long as we stay out of someone's direct line of sight, we're generally in the clear as well. None of this is the case with Syndrome, and if the basic rules and limitations aren't told to the player, it becomes total guesswork, as you never truly know what works and what doesn't. We know that one monster type in the game is blind, but for the rest of them, there's very little information given. You can't just put in a crouch button and call it a stealth game. It doesn't work that way. As a result, it's often easier to just kill most of the monsters using your wrench or tool or whatever the hell it's called, or sacrificing some of your ammunition. Annoyingly, enemies can be killed in less hits from a melee weapon than they can from headshots from a pistol. Using the tool is literally the most basic a melee combat system could be as well. You either hit or you block. I never once bothered with the block move because the slight input delay before Gallon even raises his arms is better spent on attacking something instead. There's not even any kind of heavy attack either, which just makes the melee feel horribly antiquated. Reminds me of fighting the headcrab zombies in Half-Life, where you'd kind of take a whack and then try and back up before they hit you. The game encourages you to avoid fighting during some of the loading screen text, but then frequently all but forces you into it, sending 2 or 3 enemies after you at once. So, what the hell? Similarly, the shooting is very basic. There's 3 guns, a pistol, a submachine gun, and some kind of cannon. There's 1 ammo type for each. I mean, maybe certain weapons are better against certain enemy types, but again, we're never told. You've probably got the hint by now that Syndrome has a lot of problems, and playing it I actually developed a syndrome of my own, acute brain syndrome. My symptoms were delirium, confusion, disorientation, but mostly disappointment. Syndrome's homages and influences are blatant, and it looks and it sounds great, but half-baked gameplay ultimately lets the whole thing down, and it's a damn shame. Maybe they'll patch it and fix some of these issues in the coming months, but right now it's really hard to recommend.